I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Julian Raxworthy. Julian has a PhD. He's an Australian landscape architect. Teaches in the MLA and MUD programs at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. He's a recipient of a Graham Foundation grant for advanced study in the fine arts for his book, Overgrown, as you can see here, Practices Between Landscape Architecture and Gardening, published by MIT, and he's actually on a book tour, and unfortunately we weren't able to get copies of his book. I think that was our
it's coming.
Yeah, it'll be here eventually. But Julian studied horticulture and later graduated with an undergraduate degree with honors and a research master's degree by design in landscape architecture. Both from RMIT. If you don't know RMIT, it's, at least in my mind, it was one of the best, if not the best programs in Australia. He got his PhD at the University of Queensland, and that was on gardening and landscape architecture and the connections between it, which has led to the book that I'm sure he's going to talk about some today. He's also been a visiting professor at the University of Virginia, where he met Brian Davis. And he also maintains a constant relationship with practice. He's a registered landscape architect in Australia. And he also helped develop a couple of important practices there, Aspect, which is now known as Aspect Studios, and also an architecture firm in Brisbane called Donovan Hill. He was a co-founder of Curve, and you should all know Curve. It's a student journal published at RMIT. It's a fantastic journal, so if you don't know it, go devour it. It's Curve spelled with a K, like the rest of the world spells Curve. So I first heard Julian, I don't know how many years ago it was. Beth Meyer did a panel called Inside the LA Studio for the ASLA annual meeting somewhere. And I'm sure those that were at the ASLA meeting this past week know about that. And so she made an effort to bring Australian landscape architecture to the U.S. audience. We didn't know much about it, but she sort of blew everybody away. Julian was part of that, and I've later paid much closer attention to what they're doing down there. Richard Weller is one of the ones that escaped Australia. He's the chair at Penn now. Elizabeth Mossop was at Harvard and director of LSU, and she's back there now as a dean. So I'm delighted to have Julian here and to get to see and hear him again. So please welcome Julian Raxworthy.
How much time do we have? When's the next class? We've got now.
1:30.
Yeah,
right. 1:30. Okay. So yeah, thanks Tim for inviting me here. I really appreciate it, and it's great to see old friends like Maria, who's actually known me for much longer, when I spoke at the Biennale in Barcelona in 2005. And a lot of this research actually comes from that period. I've got children. Yeah. 35, is that children? I'm not sure, okay. But yeah, so this is my, as I said, this is my book, and I'm working on it. I've been working on it for a long time. In actual fact, it sort of arose from an odd sort of situation. I've been interested in plants, obviously, as a horticulturist for a long time. And specifically, I've been interested in this idea about change and materiality of landscape architecture. And I suppose one of the things coming from an architecture school, which is what RMIT was, and in that period, in the sort of when I was educated at RMIT, there was a real looking to, and this is in the sort of period of postmodernism, post-structuralism, there was a real look to architecture as a source for design for landscape architecture. And I sort of have this sort of contention that along the way, in the process, landscape architecture sort of architecturalized, particularly in relationship to a kind of architectural avant-garde, and in the process maybe lost relations to a few of its core things, and those things I think are material. Those materials, soil, water, and notably plants, have some characteristics that really distinguish them from architectural materials. And so what I've tried to do in my research, first with topography, and now with plant material, is to try to really think about the nature of those materials and how that nature changes how we practice design, and whether we should in fact practice design differently. And so in this presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm really going to walk through the book very quickly. And the book is structured in in two main sections. And they work along a sort of a continuum between representational practice, where it's a practice of design in an office situation, that's what I would call a predictive practice, where one imagines a future, to one where at the other end of the scale we're talking about real-time design operations that are not governed by representation apart from post factum, after the fact. And so that continuum works through 3 case studies in the first half of the book that are all, we might say, sort of conventionally designed case studies, and then 3 designed works that are operating on the basis of gardening technique. And I end with a kind of conclusion, which I call a manifesto for the Veridica term, which I'll define as we proceed. There's a few sort of background ideas that are quite important for to understand the work, and I think the first one I call plant form or plan form, plant form, and it tries to, in this sort of introduction I talk about the change of a kind of avenue, or 3 different ways of seeing an avenue planting over time, to bring out some key theoretical background. So the first section of that is to talk about the fact that in a way I'm interested in form. I'm from a generation where to some extent we're in this transition between a sort of formalist, a very formalist period which came out of the sort of exposition or the later sort of excavations into landscape modernism, and then in the transition into landscape urbanism and process. And I've really been uncomfortable with the fact that there's been a polarisation between form and process in the discourse of landscape architecture. And so in this first section, what I try to do is I try to sort of nail my sort of colours to the wall and say I'm interested in space, I'm interested in form, and in a way I try to sort of excavate into theories of space and form to understand that. The first section I talk about how when we have an avenue, its description can be quite sort of straightforward for me, which is we can talk about 2 parallel lines with equidistant spacing of tree centres in between. But in actual fact, over time we know that that character of that avenue will have some relationship to the initial placement, but we'll never be able to really understand it on the basis of placement. You know, types like the tree-lined boulevard in Paris, the English country lane, or in Australia, the sort of eucalyptus on the outback track, all might have the same placement, but each time the material and its change over time will render that space completely different. So form and space is something which I talk about in some depth. I also am particularly interested in this idea of plant lives. And so I think that to some extent plants have been generally under-theorised in landscape architecture, and I think that a lot of that is because we fail to recognise the true weirdness of plants. In a sense, there's a lot of philosophy that's emerging now, you know, which talks about how animals and mammals like ourselves, you know, if we go to Goethe and a whole lot of, I mean, Goethe's an exception actually, but if we go to a whole lot of people, in philosophy we discover that there's an interest in the sort of animal realm, but in actual fact the plant realm is totally regarded as not being about beings. But over time, recently, people like Goethe and also recently people like Michael Marder have been talking about the idea of plants as beings, communal beings, beings that communicate in certain ways and that control their environment through inhibiting hormones, or through symbiosis. Key ideas like the cultivation of us by plants rather than the other way around. And I try to sort of dig into the biology of plants in the book, because in actual fact that's the language of planting design has to be tied to the language of biology in 2 things in particular, which is plant physiology and the result of plant physiology, which is plant morphology. And the third part of the kind of key part of the book, and this is something that I referred to Tim's research in relationship to, which is the relationship between landscape architecture and gardening. And so, for example, Tim talks about in his research the sort of professionalisation of landscape architecture and the way that there's been this turn from, if you go through the history of landscape architecture, obviously it fits, he argues, within a sort of a longer trajectory of professionalisation of discourses. And in a way, what I'm really interested in is how there's some split between the blue collar and the white collar, and between the designer and the practicing gardener, which is affecting our ability to produce meaningful landscape outcomes. And so in a way, a lot of this book also is about talking to the gardeners who are gardening famous pieces of landscape architecture. And so those 3 ideas, between the idea of form, space and the discourse of those, the idea of the relationship to plant physiology, and finally the sort of politics and the nature of landscape gardening, are key ideas in the book. So let's move into the case studies themselves, of which there are 3 in this section. So as I mentioned, figuring growth refers to this idea that in actual fact we are working with growth and that's the key thing in my book, which is that whenever we think we're working with wood, we're actually working with growth. Whenever we think we're working with plants, we're actually working with a transition. We're not working with a final thing. In the same way that we could say that, you know, if we talk about this idea of this tree and we predict this tree in the future as mature, now we put ourselves in that situation. We're really going to relegate our entire life until we reach maturity. Hopefully we have a whole lot of spaces and predispositions and ways between maturity and senescence and youth, etc. And plants are part of that. You know, they share more DNA with us than we share with a brick, for example. So they're interesting. So the first case study I talk about is sort of a Baroque case study. And I think that in a way there's a dialogue going through this book which reflects back to the theory that in a way I read in my early formative stages as an academic, and tries to reach back to that and sort of argue and reintroduce some of that theory. And so the relationship of the Baroque to modernism was a key aspect of that, because in a way people like Dan Kiley really acknowledged that link to the Baroque. And if we're talking these days about a sort of fascination with the territorial, you still can't go farther than, or you can't go past the Baroque as a way of dealing with the territorial. But the first moment of that I want to talk about quickly comes from a key piece of landscape at the time when I was a student, and this is obviously Vaux-le-Vicomte. This is some of the masterwork of, or the tasteful masterwork of Lenotte compared to the sort of regarded as tasteless Versailles. And what's interesting is when you read the writing of Alan Weiss, which I'm sure you've come across, which is Anamorphosis Absconditus, what he was sort of fascinated with as part of the time, and a trope of the time, was around perspective and anamorphosis, the idea that this space at the back here where we have all these and bring these expectations to what it is, we expect statuary down here. In actual fact, what we discover is piles of mortar that are piled in grotesque shapes that we read from a distance to be sculptures. We read levels and widths differently, and in a way the Baroque or landscape was about those things. But at the same time, when I visited it, you know, as much as I was awed, I was bored. And in actual fact, the main thing that really piqued my interest was the relationship between the territorial organisation of the garden and this massive transverse canal and main landscape figure, and the transition into the regenerating landscape. And so here we're seeing, you know, this is productive landscape. You know, productive. We're fascinated in this idea of the productive landscape, but you know, the productive landscape was always driving landscape architecture, in a sense, in the precedents we look back at. One of the things I'm also critical of is the fact that I think we have sort of appropriated a lot of non-landscape things and made them landscape things in our history books. And so here is, you know, in this project, what we're looking at is a maintenance strategy that's aimed at working in that transition between these two states. And so if you wander into this space, this is a space of regeneration. It's a space where there's no real weeding apart from early on to select out certain species. It uses things like competition to grow trees tall to allow them to be logged. And the key things, in a way, that change that transition from the space of the garden to the space of regeneration is this sequence between hedges, trees, all organised according to techniques such as mowing, cutting, etc., all timed around agricultural systems of management. And so that's something that, in a way, in that trip when I visited Vaux-le-Vicomte, I also discovered another garden that's called Chateau Courance. And in that garden, I discovered in quite an accidental way, because of the fact that I was in a pre-Google Maps way. I had a book called The Gardens of Europe by Penelope Hobhouse there on the seat next to me, and I'm sort of flicking across the map and trying not to have an accident. And in actual fact, there's a line jumped out which said, you know, here's this garden, they say is by Lenotte, but if it was by Lenotte, then he was in a particularly romantic frame of mind. And I thought that's an interesting way of thinking about Lenotte. I've never thought of Lenotte as romantic. And a lot of it was about this row of trees and plains here. And in a way, that space of those trees is actually a space where, when you look at this garden, Courance, over 400 years, what you discover is that in actual fact, the persistence of the line is really remarkable considering the amount of political and socio-economic change that occurred during that time. We had, during that time, owners build this, go broke multiple times, trying to maintain and develop the garden. We had at least one revolution. We had a number of world wars. We had the fall of fortunes. And what happened is that, in a way, this whole space of the garden, when I sort of looked into it, according to the horticultural conventions of the time, the use of plant material changed radically the entire spatiality of this line. So even though the figure maintained a constancy, its kind of edges and spatialities fluctuated according to different fashions around what were hedges versus what were trees. And what we see now in it, this character, resulted largely because of the fact that twice in its development it was left alone completely. And that meant that the trees developed unpruned forms that were so great by the time that the people returned to the garden that they had to work with what they found. And that gave it a particular character. You know, Vincent Scully talked about, in this garden, how over time he talked about this sort of grave symphony of grass, trees and water. But when you dig into the garden, what you find is Jean de Genève, who was the count in the 20th century who managed to bring that garden back into his family after 200 years, 300 years of it not being in the family, was only able to do so by, in a way, developing a method of management that was about using industrial agricultural techniques. And so what happened is the landscape got stripped back, stripped back, stripped back, all of the detail disappeared until it had to be something which is a hedge cutter on the side of a tractor and a mower, and then one annual visit to tree surgeons with chainsaws. And so in a way that stripped that garden back to a state which brought out its raw sort of essence. And when we look at it now, the same things that happened then around ways that the maintenance and management techniques we used to establish the forest have been re-established. And so here we have an example where in that space there, this is a regenerating landscape which has been cut with a sort of mower, a sort of hardcore mower behind a tractor. And what that's doing is it's cutting a grid, and the stuff that's regenerating in between the grid intervals is then, that's a way of setting up the tree spacing, because everything is regenerating in the uncut parts. So rather than saying I'm going to plant a plant that's here, here and here, what I'm going to do is cut the space in between so that the plants that are in between, that are in the uncut zones, can regenerate, and then after that I'll then come in later on and I'll cut the ones out that I don't want. So it's a really different approach, but it still on this side operates within the same sort of language of maintenance. Now the second case study is a kind of, is one that is a very interesting one to me, and I think it ties back to my attempt to try to find this language of planting design and try to explore that language, and that was to look at the Miller Garden by Dan Kiley. And of course we should all be familiar with that garden as, you know, landscape enthusiasts. And the part of the garden that I was most interested in was the honey locust alley, which is often talked about. The honey locust alley, you know, comes from the, as it's called, you know, Peter Walker called it the sort of spiral plan. And it's one side of that. And the way that that's talked about, and the language that it's talked about, is what I refer to as an architectural analogue. And so by an architectural analogue, what I mean is that in actual fact, the language, almost all of the language that's used to describe it, treats it as if it's a piece of architecture. And so what I was really interested in that idea, and it's something that actually a student of mine pointed out to me, is that as I've been sort of developing some of these in theory seminars, these ideas, he said, if it's not about growth, is it really a garden? And therefore, if this is not about growth, could this actually be a piece of architecture made of plants? You know, he's credited in the book. His name's Frank Kleinsmith, and it's a really interesting idea. And when you look at the readings, you discover that over and over. And when you look at the history of this garden over time, what you discover is that increasingly, this is, you know, one of those fantastic things that the Institute of Modern Art Indianapolis Museum of Art has an amazing digital archive about the garden and the house. And what you've discovered is there's never been a static point where those trees performed uniformly. This is an example of where this indicates all the trees that had to be replaced in just one of the intermediate periods. And so there's like 7 tree surgery things between 1958 and its most recent replanting. And not only has it been replanted twice, in between those every single tree has been replaced at least once. And each time they're trying to get a bigger and bigger tree to replace it with to maintain the architectural effect. I know all of this by talking to the gardener, the head gardener, a guy called Ben Weaver, and he and I talked quite a lot about how and why, and I discuss in the book the issues horticulturally with why these issues arose. My first thing was that I've been reading Hildebrand's writing about the garden, And when I went to visit it, what I discovered is that this was the honey locust LA. Finally replanted, all of the tree, all of the soil totally removed again from scratch. And so it tells you that this idea of this icon of planting design, there's this backstory, right? There's a whole other way of understanding what was happening. And so obviously for me, if we look at the modernism, and we look at the work of, this is a classic piece of, this is Greg Bleem's, classic axonometric of the Miller Garden from the 80s, early CAD sort of exercise. You can see that that's entirely architectonic in how it understands trees. That was a radical idea at the time, and so we have to recognise that. But it doesn't correspond to any idea about trees as organisms, plants as organisms. We look at the work of James Rose, probably still the most significant theorist around plant material in landscape architecture. And this is his sort of his taxonomy of plant forms, and he's trying to utilise these sort of Bauhaus ideas in a sort of and understand them in relationship to plants. And so he's working with transparency, etc. But there's one thing that's implicit to all of this, which is never discussed, which is growth. These have to get to this point before they can have that architectonic effect. So implicit within it is growth, yet growth is never discussed. And so that's, I'm from the generation when deconstruction was something, right? And deconstruction as an idea talks about the revealing the foundation of the discipline as a way to twist it and change it to make it productive. And so for me, this is one of those key moments. So if we look at this, all of those forms are actually the result of successful physiology leading to successful morphology. And so for me, this is then the transition into the next case study, which I've written about quite a bit, which is the work of a guy called Sven-Ingvar Andersen. And in this chapter, this is the last chapter before I go into the second half of the book, Sven-Ingvar Andersen was written about extensively by Anne Spirn, who I also have to acknowledge was a fantastic and generous reader of and commenter on my manuscript along the way, which is something that is so valuable, it's sort of hard to give enough thanks to that. And she, because she's a Dane, even though he's actually a Swede, he worked in, Sven-Ingvar Andersen worked a lot in Denmark. He was a student of C.T.H. Sorensen, who's one of the great educators and landscape architects of the modern period in Scandinavia. And so Spirn used this garden in the language of landscape, which is where I discovered it. It was a follow-up in a way, or art follow-up to the Granite Garden. She talked about this garden in relationship to how he described it as a correlation between his age and the garden. And so the whole landscape of the garden was set up around the planting of hawthorns. And so he planted these hawthorns, and what he cut them into the shape of chickens or hens, and he called this the hen yard. And he talks about, even though it's a sort of glib sort of term, he talks about the fact that and this is the kind of classic photo of the hen yard here. He talks about how, this is the period when it was being discussed mostly, the image of what it looked like. He talks about how only for as long as he can get up the ladder with a pair of clippers and cut those hawthorns, will those hawthorns be hens. And at a certain point, they will regress from being hens to being a hawthorn grove. And inside them is a latency, it's something I talk about a lot in the book, a latency which is that they can be both hawthorns and hedges at any one moment in time, only according to management. So if you think about a material where what you do to it changes its entire nature, that's a pretty radical idea if we think about this from a design frame. So I went there thinking to myself, bless him, he's passed away, it's a tragedy. I met him, I never got to visit the garden, unfortunately. And of course I went there expecting to see a hawthorn grove, and what I saw was a whole lot of hens. And the hens were the same because, and this is something I found over and over, of course the children are trying to protect the form as a representation of their father, not understanding that he was undertaking a process and the form was actually part of that. And if you said to him, probably as many of them, their parents had actually said to their children, don't just try to keep it how I did it, do your own thing, because this whole thing came out of an activity I was doing, which is gardening. It's not an artifact, it's a process. And so instead what I discovered, I'm really into this idea of misvisiting sites. A lot of the time we see particular representations of sites. And in actual fact, visiting this garden, what I discovered was, of course, the hawthorn grove was the same, but the rest of the garden was totally different. And the photos, if we look at this, and I've made such a mistake here, that this is like, I should fail for this, which is that I've got two plans, one inverted from the other in front of you. I don't know how many, if I was in a studio like now, I would be caned for this, rightfully. But this is Sven Ingvar Andersson's original diagram of the garden. And then what I did is because I entered, instead of seeing the hen yard, I entered through the back of the site. I discovered a kind of really weird wilderness that was totally unlike the photographs that I'd originally seen of that garden and those hedge spaces. So these are the photos along the way of what those corridor garden room spaces were. Whereas when I visited, what I saw is spaces that were much more, I'll find one here, which were much more wild. And those spaces, spaces like this, and this one for me was a particularly interesting one, where that same spacing, those exact same plants are still in the locations, 500mm spacings, exactly the same locations, very few species. I indicate here the plants that have disappeared, but in actual fact almost none of the plants have disappeared, but the actual spaces are completely different. And that idea that you can have one plan with no plan change, but radically different spatial effect is key to me, because it says that we can't trust that our sense of the drawing as a way of understanding form over time, it can't be trusted, because in actual fact there's an opportunity, which is the metamorphosis of that same form over time through management. And so if we can understand these kind of spaces, those kind of spaces are examples of where the planting decisions about spacing, and we can see how this space in here is quite a tight sort of space versus this one. What we're seeing, and this is the space that I'm looking at in that image above, is this space here. What we can see is that at a certain point in time, in actual fact, the ones that got away, where he didn't prune, were presumably the ones that eventually became these tall sort of shrubby trees. And eventually they competed with each other for light, they lost their lower greenery, and he made the decision to let them go. And so then we have a totally different architectonic effect that's exactly the same in terms of its formal description that it would have had in terms of the plan. And so for me this is a key idea, and it comes to a key concept in the whole book, which I utilise and really is what the whole book is around. And here's another example, how does this appear on the plan? This is a kind of process of opening up interpenetrating views in the garden. It can only happen through management. And so the key term I look at is to try to think about what is the tectonic of plants. We know that term from architecture, the tectonic. Which, the tectonic in architecture talked about by Frampton, for example, originally a term from Semper, was originally trying to sort of talk about, it was sort of tied to the idea of an expression of construction. That was how it was understood in some sense in architecture. But if you go back to Semper's writing, it was actually about the carpenter and the relationship of the carpenter to the material, which is to say that you can't understand the structure using timber without, for example, the carpenter with a hammer and a chisel. And so similarly, I thought this is a nice analogy for plant material, because you can't really understand and work with plant material unless you work with maintenance over time. Even if we have an idea that the garden that we've designed or the landscape that we've designed is going to be a certain way in the future, we're still assuming gardening to make it there all the time. And so, in a way, the idea of the veridic, which is the term I sort of invented, was to sort of look at for a way in to a new model for the tectonic. And so the reason I came to this, a lot of these things are situational, right? So I'm actually, in the library writing, and I used to write this book in the 2 hours a day, and so I was in the art school library, and there was a book on the history of colours, a whole series on colours, and of course, I'm procrastinating a little bit, wandering around, opened the book on green. And so what I discovered in that idea of green is, we come to the idea of viridis as the colour green, tied to the idea of the garden in Latin, that viridarium, and viridesco, and all of these terms, a lot of which end up in spring, growth, and the idea that the garden and the colour are tied to the garden as a space for growth. And so therefore I use this term and create this sort of term, the veridic, to be able to talk about both we have this sort of easy idea of green and vegetation, but the idea that that term is tied fundamentally to growth, and therefore also to the practices of the gardener is what I was working towards. And if I look at that, for me this is a key example, and this is from sort of diagram for one of the hedges I found. It's an interesting thing when you can have one plant, biologically the same plant, that has a hedge on one side, a shrub on the other, and a tree on another edge. And that's all around maintenance and management. And if you go back to the history of plant morphology, which is around, well, not the history of it, but the sort of, is bud location, activity and time. A lot of this results all from things like whether it was pruned at one point or another over 1 year, where the buds were and how the pruning activity of the tool happened. And all of that results in massive formal difference. And so that's how, this is sort of language that Anderson talked about. Now if we go to the next, so that's the design, that's the sort of, we're now in a sort of like, people talk about in the arrow of time, Eddington's arrow of time. And so we've moved from the office into the space of draw and prediction. We saw diagrams about what Anderson thought in the 1950s when he planted those hedges about what it was going to be. And ultimately we're now moving into the space of somebody cutting something with a hedge of clippers. And I call it gardening design because also I'm trying to sort of argue that gardening is a type of design decision making in the field. And in actual fact, rather than polarising gardening and landscape architecture, we need to start to recognise that actually gardeners make decisions all the time that have some design aspect to them. They're not always great, but at the same time we still have to recognise that. And so a logical place to sort of start to talk about this is in the CTO Roberto Burle Marx. And so the CTO Burle Marx, I'm sure you know it, it's Burle Marx's own landscape laboratory, as he called it. He said at the source of all of his ideas about landscape architecture. And in that, it's a sort of a really interesting space because it's sort of structured around it's originally got a sort of a church in it and a range of buildings, and he sort of worked in that space in an improvisatory manner. And there's very few, if any, drawings of what he did there. Almost all of the things he did there, and much of his work, apart from when he ends up in a sort of over certain sizes, a lot of the work is composed at some level from the eye. And so a lot of it, the site has all the things that we would expect to know from Burle Marx. And I discovered this reading by this guy called Ribeiro Diaz. And Ribeiro Diaz was the original director of the CTO Burle Marx when it was given to the patrimony, or the sort of heritage of the state of in Brazil. And in actual fact, Ribeiro kind of convinced Burle Marx to make it a site for the public. But over time, what happened was that the emphasis of the patrimony was about a monument to Burle Marx. And instead, what Ribeiro said is it's not a monument, it's his working space. And so if you try to stop it, and if you try to freeze it, you're missing what the whole space was about, which was as a space of testing. Ultimately, they wanted it as an exhibit, and he had to do a lot of stuff around developing plantings and working with it in certain ways to allow it to get that character. But in actual fact, its real nature was a place of testing. And the kind of testing that Burle Marx did is sort of interesting, and I talk about in the book, is around, he would go on these plant collection trips, and he had an idea about those trips, and there's sort of two ideas which he would say to have and to use as his two processes that he would do. He'd go out and collect the plant, and a lot of the time he would have young students, and he'd look up in the distance in the rainforest, take them off for 2 months to the rainforest and say, I see a bromeliad, and then send off some young student up a tree to get the bromeliad. And then he would bring that bromeliad back into his greenhouse, and this process is called, with shade house, it's called acclimation, where he starts to kind of work out what it can do. And the process of what he would do with it is, here's an example of one of those plants that's in the shade house. And of course this is the plant when it's used in the garden. And the way he would work with it is he would get that plant, he would plant in full sun, no water, some water. He would deal with it in all of these environments in the garden to try to work out what it was able to do. Now, Henk Gerritsen, who's one of the writers, the theorists behind the Dutch wave, we know the Dutch wave mostly now through Piet Oudolf, but Gerritsen was one of, Oudolf is just one of the Dutch wave with Rob Hendricks and with this guy Henk Gerritsen. And Gerritsen developed this term that he called ecological amplitude, which is the idea that in a way we have to start to understand the ecological amplitude, the range that a plant can have. And we're always working within that range of whether it can handle full sun, shade, etc. Now in this chapter, what I'm really also working with, and there's a sort of background here, which is that, I've been interested in change for the whole time while I've been doing my research. And obviously, in a way, what happened was that a sort of discussion about change was hijacked by what I've called the sort of the process discourse, which is, you know, you might know as landscape urbanism, etc. And so I've been really interested in, and slightly, I've had the same interests as landscape urbanism, but I've been very suspicious of it because of what I call its sort of scientism, which is that it's an attempt to try to relegate design to a series of scientific factors and then to try to use that as a way of hiding authorship. And also of hiding aesthetic predispositions and under a language of science. And this is a useful example because for Burl Marx, you know, this is the great thing about modernism, is that they were always involved in an aesthetic quest and what they saw as a scientific quest at the same time. Now they did have their own hidden interests, etc. But so what I do in this chapter is I try to theorise a link between biology and aesthetics. And I use the idea of plant functional type as the way of doing that. Plant functional type is a evolutionary ecology way of understanding plants, which is to say that certain environmental situations that are consistent to certain climate zones across the world and relationships to things like earlier plant populations demonstrate similar characteristics. So we could go to, for his example, and you know, I could go to northern Queensland in Australia, I could go to the Amazon, I could go to the Congo, and I'll start to find similar plants with similar plant functional evolutionary characteristics in all those places. So you could retwist and say, you know, Burl Marx's interest in aroids in the family Araceae, still has the biggest collection of aroids in the world in this garden. In a way, he's actually, at the same time as he's choosing certain things, he's actually selecting certain types of plants. And so I try to theorise plant functional type as a way of merging aesthetics and biology. Now, we're now into this space, and obviously the other thing to notice is, you know, there was an inherent maintenance in the work, and he wasn't interested in maintenance, but he was a gardener. But you know, if we compare this, you know, this is a very classic Simma Eliofsson picture of the space outside the art gallery in Rio. And when you visit it now, it's presumably been reinstalled a few times. Now, of course, what you see, you still see a ghosting in that lawn. But it's only maintenance and reinstallation and those techniques that would have allowed that figure to persist. And so it's always implicit, but it's not always described. In the final two case studies, what I try to move on to is to talk about other examples of types of practice of landscape that are not necessarily by landscape architects at all. And the one example I talk about is this garden called Drumshardain, which is in Scotland, that was undertaken by this guy here, whose name is G.F. Dutton. And that, you know, I'm open to serendipity, and in more procrastination, when I was doing my PhD, I went to a bookshop, and I, you know, as a sort of try to make myself feel not so guilty, I went to the gardening section, and I found this book called Some Branch Against the Sky, the practice and principles of marginal gardening. And that idea of marginal gardening really interested me, and as a particular sort of way of theorising. Like, you know, we can recognise design by a lot of things, and to some extent you can recognise design by how people talk about ideas. And so you don't necessarily have to be a designer to be able to hear that way of talking. Sometimes we hear it in artists, sometimes we hear it in musicians, but there's a certain sort of speculation, and you can hear that in his work. His garden, when I visited, and you know, when I researched him, he's a super interesting guy. You know, anything we know now about action of drugs comes from his writing. So if previously we knew you could take a certain thing to be able to deal with, you know, antibiotic or whatever else, but the ability to get through the blood-brain barrier and the use of enzymes in the body to break down those drugs into formats that could cross the blood-brain barrier and could move into the body comes from his research. And he was still the world's leading authority in that. But at the same time, he was also a poet. And so he would also write a lot of poetry. And there's a lot of this book and this research I refer to his poetry from this book, Harvesting the Edge. He was also a mountaineer, and he did this really crazy thing, which is he was into sort of underwater forests, and so he would take photos of forests underwater. So he was quite an interesting guy, and the marginal garden, as he called it, is quite an interesting. It's quite an interesting thing, and so the marginal garden had a whole lot of things. On the one hand, it was on the margin, which is to say it was on the margin, the garden was on the margin between the space of regeneration and agricultural land ownership. It was on the margin between climatic zones, between the sort of alpine heather and forest and etc. It was also, you know, as he says, it located the limit of cultivation. At the same time, it's also the fact that it, you know, it had marginal economic value, you know, and so he also, and probably most important, most interesting was, it was marginally differentiated from its environment. And this idea is interesting to me, which is that the idea of, do we know if something's been designed or not? And I talk a lot, not so much in this book, but in my most recent research, I'm also writing a lot about, now that I live in South Africa, I'm writing about decolonisation and landscape architecture in relationship to how we only seem to respect artefacts, not processes. And so Indigenous, we will respect Stonehenge, but we won't respect Aboriginal fire practices because we utilise artefactuality as our guide to see design. And so this is something I'm quite interested in. So in this garden, you don't ever quite see exactly what it's like. And so he was also interested in this idea of meddling and using minimal work. And so in that space of that garden, he would really just install, and here's an example of this is a photo of his work, and a lot of the work was post factum documented in terms of he was using diaries to document what he was doing. The way he talked about what he was doing was using a language of spatiality, of creating rooms, passages, etc. He a lot of the time used military kind of metaphors about creating a base camp with, like, you know, creating these little hutches with, like, you know, saws and secateurs and bags of fertilizer and a raincoat. And he'd like have 6 of these base stations through this landscape that he would just repeatedly walk this route backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. And he would be grooming this landscape and marginally doing little things. Interestingly, when, you know, these are the photos of when it was in its prime, and he was very careful that you would never know exactly if something had happened, exactly whether the plant was ornamental or not. Most of it was manipulated by him. And this is what it looks like now. And it's interesting that the only activity that the children now do is that they use a brush cutter or a strimmer to sort of try to keep the passages open. But in a way, this is because they have this sort of fear of losing his legacy without understanding the nature of his work. Now, one of the other things he talks about, and for me something which is really important, you know, he was also talking about the sort of thermodynamic. And this piece of poetry was really important for me in understanding that. It's only the simple sunlight on a fence post out of snow, and I come to set it upright at the cost of a single blow. Then I leave them to the sunlight, one straight post trodden snow. And so for me, I was interested in this because it has a number of things. It's a process, which is the process of actually setting the post right. There's a physical change, which is the post's new position. There's an ephemeral trace, which is actually the footsteps in the snow. And this idea of the kind of the sort of action of the sunlight and his blow in a kind of thermodynamic process. And so a lot of my writing also I try to talk about thermodynamics in relationship to these activities, and to try to find a continuum of gardening practice and as an energetic practice that cultivates the landscape. Other examples I utilise include the Eco Cathedral by Louis Leroy, where he would basically pile piles of rocks or piles of bricks, and those bricks would create microclimates, and seeds would get stuck in them, soil would get stuck in them, and over time he built a landscape just by placing one brick and another brick. And he would say, you know, all I do is I just put down one brick, and then another one just happens to come along, another one happens to come along. And he would say, I have a huge, you know, he's interested in this idea that we put time, we use money to measure time all the time in the West. We're always, everything is about time and money. And he would say, I'm more interested in the fact that my single brick placing action produces an amazing growth return thermodynamically. And he's like, this is the only way we should think. And we know now that any idea about the future ecological city is thermodynamic. So the final case study is one called Inselhombroich, which is like one of the great gardens, I would say, and sort of art projects in Europe. And as a space, Inselhombroich is fascinating because it's a piece of work that comes from a collector, crazy collector, a guy called Muller. It's outside of Dusseldorf, and Muller had this idea of a kind of collaboration between art and nature, with this idea again of energetic transfer, which is there's a kind of the creative impulse of people and the creative impulse of nature they actually have a synchronicity to each other that sort of should not be ignored. Somewhat rhetorical, and the landscape of it that's created by a guy called Bernard Korte, which I'll talk about, was this sort of Nieder-Rhine landscape. It's a sort of landscape typology that sort of we would see that comes through from Belgium, the Netherlands, into parts of Germany. It's a sort of wetland landscape. You know, the buildings along it, which are these sort of miniature art galleries, and each one of them designed by an artist whose name is Hierik, not an architect, are really fascinating because inside them they have artworks that are unlabelled, and they are curated by a guy called Graubner, and they're related to a sequence of walking through that landscape. And so in a way you don't know whose work it is. You actually have to take this path, and how you find it, how you've moved yourself through the landscape, will bring to it a certain sort of interpretation to the work. There are multiple doors that you can leave via. How you leave from this one will determine how you enter the next one. And each time it's all back to you as the observer to work out what's going on. And it's a fascinating process of interrogating one's own aesthetic interests and one's own... It's kind of unsettling in a weird way because we expect to be told that this is important. We expect to know, oh, this is a Robert Rauschenberg, or this is a Picasso, or this is that. But suddenly when you're in a situation where you don't get told that, when you're actually inside a narrative sequence that's maybe someone worked on or maybe you made yourself, it's quite a fascinating change. One of the most interesting ones for me is this one, such a lovely landscape relationship, is a series of Khmer, heads. Obviously, this is like, we know that this is a terrible thing because it's stealing of somebody's cultural property. But nonetheless, in that landscape, it's quite amazing when you walk into that room because those heads are looking through that window, and straight away those heads' gaze turn you to look into the landscape. And that landscape is actually an old English garden, and the core of it is an old English garden. And so this example, I heard about it through a mutual friend of Maria's and I, Lisa Dietrich, who took me to this garden because she said, I know you're interested in this maintenance stuff, you should see this garden, they use maintenance techniques. And there are lots of really interesting bits and pieces that I find. This for me is a nice example of where the figure of this in plan is just one solid vegetated chunk, but in actual fact the way that these plants are pruned allows for a kind of transparency that we can imagine James Rose might have been interested in as a way of sort of moving through that space of threshold. There's also the utilisation of pruning in relationship to the sort of other plants. So this is like a tree that's got a room underneath it, inside there where you can sit and have a coffee, etc. And so, but when I looked into the project, I was really interested in three people who worked on the project. One is the original designer, a guy called Bernard Korte. The second is the sort of current landscape manager, a landscape architect whose name is Burkhard Daum. And finally the gardener, Klaus Weistreck, who is actually the gardener working on the field. And that sort of transition from somebody who actually worked in a predictive way about what they thought was going to happen in the future from nothing, somebody who's managing that in a kind of an abstract sense of moving around labour is one of the things that's happening now. And finally, Klaus is actually working on the ground entirely. And how do those different design conceptions change how we frame what design is? Korte is fascinating because he was actually he was originally a antique dealer in Dusseldorf who just, when he finished university, was encouraged to do a PhD in nursery management. So he did a PhD in nursery management around the economics of mass nursery production, totally no design to it at all. And in actual fact, after that, he just was running this antique shop, and Muller kept buying antiques for him and said, how do you find you? And found a bit of his biography, how do you do this? Oh, I've got a PhD in horticulture. He said, I've got this museum, do you want to design it for me? And so he at the time, it was in the 80s, and the environmental movement was sort of, in Germany, was quite strong, and basically they wouldn't let Korte do anything other than recreate the pre-European or the seemingly indigenous landscape of the Nieder-Rhine. And for him, he was willing to go along with that only insofar as he thought that he was interested in the kind of aesthetics of beings, is what he would say. The aesthetic of grass, the butterfly, a bit of the sky, the change in temperature. He has a fascinating way of understanding aesthetics, and that influences me in terms of my attempt to utilise aesthetics as a bridge between the sort of different lives in the garden. And in his process of doing it, what he said is, I can only do this ecological restoration thing if we treat this as a cultural landscape, because we can't really say, we can't pinpoint this moment. Where is this moment we're restoring to? And so instead he started to look at the Niederlorraine landscape and the use of pollards and other techniques that are used in the history of that landscape, and he finally could come to a way that he could do this restoration job, which was around that, treating that as a cultural landscape with this sort of synthesis. He talks about this great story where, where they had to get, he wanted to get these pollarded willows, and he found a farm in Belgium that had 150 of them. He went in winter to pick them up with 2 trucks. They got back to the German border and they said, you can't bring that in, that's biological material, and he managed to convince them that it was actually firewood. And he got it into Germany as firewood. He's a fascinating guy, and the only drawing from that time was the drawing that he found a random architecture student, and that they required a drawing, and he said, I don't draw, I just move things around and decide what's happening. And this random architecture student then drew this single only plan. He still doesn't know the name of the student who drew that for him. And so his practice was entirely based on the ground. He ultimately, he and Muller had a fight, because Muller said, you're thinking you're an artist now, and I got you in here as this sort of aesthete and gardener, and you got too high impressions of yourself, and so he got booted out. 10 years later, this guy, Burckhardt, came in, and because of the fact that they recreated this sort of delta on the site, the water that was coming onto the site was actually manure, fused water and soil from a nearby piggery. And so the first 5 years, he says, was the process of extracting nutrient from that soil. That's something that that the Dutch wave and Hank Gerritsen talks about a lot, which is in the Northern Hemisphere, in this sort of landscape you guys are in a way the controlling of nutrient rather than the fertilisation process is the most important thing. Because the more you actually fertilise, the more you create competition, which inevitably the weeds will win. And so instead what you need to do is limit and limit and limit and limit fertility, and work with plants in that way and work with their ecological amplitude. And so Burckhardt's first act was to kind of try to find plants that operate in that frame. Now, if you're interested, Hank Gerritsen's book, and I know you guys have a sort of horticulture-related school, Hank Gerritsen's book, The Essay on Gardening, I would say is one of the most significant things that's been published in English about 6 years ago by Architectura and Natura Press. And so, in a way, Burckhardt's work is quite interesting because his is entirely based around the spreadsheet. And so the spreadsheet and GIS is his simulation of GIS. He says, unfortunately, I started this thing in Illustrator and I'm still doing it in Illustrator 10 years later because I never learned GIS. I know it would be better, but this is what I do. And so, in actual fact, this spreadsheet determines everything that happens. And so I talked to him in quite a lot of depth to say, is this actually a design document? And he was quite emphatic, it is a design document, because every condition we see on site about which we could have any sense of its quality in aesthetic or spatial terms results from a management decision from him. And so he has to maintain or develop those characters entirely through the division and operation of labour. He is a landscape architect. He worked for Lutznau 7, he worked on the Hamburg Hafen City. I mean, he's a seriously experienced guy who says, I never do a drawing, all I do is do spreadsheets and direct people now. And so when I talk to him, he talks about the idea, and so I try to dig into this idea of design, and he talks about this idea which he calls the frame. And so I remember back in the day, Corner was talking about the idea of eidetic landscape, which is the relationship between a kind of mental landscape and the physical landscape. There's been a lot of, over the years, people have called this typology and a whole range of things. I'm not going to buy into the sort of the theory around it, but in a way I think that over time your mental landscape is the most important one that determines what the landscape is going to look like. If the biggest problem between gardeners and landscape architects arises from the fact that at no point do the gardeners get taken into the mental picture of what that landscape is like, because there's certain terms of reference that a gardener has that are different from that a landscape architect has. Finding that moment of understanding is interesting. I mean, for me, I always have this thing which is I use music to talk to people. Say I meet some guy somewhere at a pub who's a friend of my wife's. We're two guys, we don't know each other. What do we start talking about? We start talking about music. What sort of music do you like? Like this. Weave our way through, and that utilisation of types is a way of canvassing group ideas. And so he talks about this as he calls this the tropical forest. In actual fact, it's, it's in Germany, there's nothing tropical about it. But the characteristic of a certain closed canopy, a certain quality of green, a certain quality of shadow is what he talks about. And after that, all of the spreadsheet actions are aimed at maintaining that frame, as he calls it, about creating openings to encourage plants to grow through, closing holes in canopies, opening holes in canopies, introducing things into the margin between the forest and the grass landscape, using mowing in certain sorts of ways, and all the time, rather than judging it against a drawing, he's judging it against his mental frame about what it is. And he also refers to this thing called the leash. And he uses an example of those dog leashes that are retractable. Is a really weird analogy, but and so he says, you let that leash out a certain amount and you pull it back. And that leash is what he's always working with in his spreadsheets, about how much change he can allow, how much it can transform, how it can stay the same. And that's a really nice bridge to go into the final character in the final case study here, which is this guy, Klaus. And Klaus, for me, as a gardener, and I worked as a municipal gardener in a park for 5 years before I studied landscape architecture, and so I really felt, I understood how he was operating and had forgotten that. And the first thing he says to me is, everyone talks about and wants this landscape of the Niederrhein, the single view that you see with the cultural landscape, etc. And then he says, but let me take you to the place where I'll show you what it's really about. And so he takes me to this place that he calls the disaster area. He says a storm came through here a few weeks ago and 100 trees were taken down. And he said, I will not ever have the ability now to remove those trees, to recreate a whole lot of trees. I have 5 staff. This is a major part of the garden. The budgets never change. And so instead what he's going to have to do is manage his way through the catastrophe. He says, I'm going to have to work with regeneration. I'm going to have to work with selective weeding. I'm going to have to work with introductions of plants. And ultimately he and Burkhardt are going to have to work out a modification of the frame of this garden as a space, and then utilise the same techniques that they have in terms of time to make it happen. Now, he's got an interesting sort of history in this landscape. He's in the 80s when he was a young man, he was actually at this site protesting against NATO nuclear programs. And so there was, at this point, this is actually a rocket station, a nuclear rocket station, and Muller, when it was decommissioned, Muller bought it as the sort of hub for Inselhombräuch. And so for him, there's a kind of thing about his sort of social and political life as a young man in this site. Now, those case studies and the way that I've tried to approach them has been to really talk about this transition from a sort of like a design-based mode that we might know in terms of form and space, a representation, a predictive space, through into the idea of working with a management space or with an improvisational space. And the way I end the book is with a manifesto. And I mean, we're this generation where I think manifestos were something that we thought were cool. Architects did them. They were kind of strong and opinionated. And I kind of like the idea of doing a manifesto of plants because they're so unmanifesto-like. They're hardly, their violence to them is a different kind of violence. And so in the conclusion, I try to talk about a range of different things and different ideas from the book as a kind of summary and propose a certain sort of practice. And some of the key ideas, and probably one of the most key ones for me, is that the plant material is growth. And so this is, I think for me, this is super important because we think of plant material as really as a specification of location and a prediction of spacing. And so we sort of choose the individual, choose its location, and then we just let it rip and we just hope that it's going to end up in this space. But if we don't think about, the most interesting thing is to think about plants as growth and to then think about how crazy that is in a material way if we start to operate and come from the space of design. It's a crazy thing that we work with a material that transforms over time. Other ideas that are really important that come out of this is a recognition that maintenance has to be explicit now, I think. We can't no longer work with the idea that, in actual fact, it's going to just be all right. Our prediction will come out along the end. All we're interested in is the initial plant establishment period, or the defects period, between practical and final completion, and after that it's someone else's problem, and if it goes wrong, all we'll say is they never managed it properly how I wanted it to. Maintenance is the wrong term, and in the same way that that's the wrong view. Because in actual fact, maintenance, like resilience, is a failing position. Because in actual fact, maintenance assumes staticness, that we have to return it, keep it in a certain sort of way. If we really believe that plants are about growth, maintenance is never the way to think about it. In the same way that resilience is never the way to think about it, because resilience is only going to be resilient until it fails. We have to think about a forward position. That's why I refer to Nicholas Nassim Taleb's work around anti-fragility as a mode of thinking. He talks about, how the muscle gets stressed, and the way that the bodybuilder builds their body is through stressing the muscle to get bigger muscle. And so he refers to this as an alternative, hormesis as an alternative to resilience. I also think that one of the things that's really important, I think people would accept that these days, but in actual fact that really we're working with the environment to cultivate the qualities in plants we want. Plants grow in the ground, they have certain conditions, certain things that they like. In a way, anything we do is about cultivating conditions. We're actually always working on that space of cultivating conditions, and I think that's super important. As I've talked about previously, latent effects are super important about working with vegetation. That they have within it, that the hawthorn has within it, the hawthorn grove or the hedge of garden brooms. All of the plants you work with have those different characteristics. As we start to know that people start to like things like the seed head of the dead flower as well as the flower, that's where we're starting to move into a recognition that we're interested in a change of state in the plant. But ultimately that's something that needs to come forward much more strongly. As I say also that, I'm not interested in this polarisation between form and process. I think we need to always think about those two things in the same breath. And I refer to Stanford Quinter's writing around formation as this sort of thing, which he would talk about how in some of the great works of the modernists, this process of form and this process of formation are actually tied to each other. And also the idea of not separating the aesthetic and the biological. And the easy way to talk about this is to say they can't be separated because you'll never choose a plant that you don't like visually. Who puts a plant in a landscape that they don't like? So straight away there's always some aestheto-formal decision in there somewhere. And if the plant can't grow, the only way it can grow is by having some level of scientific understanding about the plant. Otherwise it'll die. And so we can't really, any attempt to try to put those two separately, which we do in horticulture curriculums all the time, is disingenuous. It's also, for me, very much about action and changing the relationship between representation and action. And I think this is where we move to the biggest challenge in the entire book and my argument, which is to say, I'm nudging towards the idea of a different practice of landscape architecture. And that's how I end. And I think that practice really changes the relationship between the white-collar, blue-collar relationship, which is to say that in a way we need to move into a space where we are actually operating in the field in a much more direct way. Obviously there are hierarchies of labour and all those things, but I think rather than thinking that we can deal with maintenance through a maintenance specification, we might need to think about reformulating our models of practice, changing our relationships to things like design, construct, maintain. And I think that there's actually an enormous amount of future and an enormous amount of business in that space. And so really I end on this idea that what this really entails is a change of practice. And to some extent that's the end, that's also the beginning of the part that I really think has to follow this book. And it's obviously something that we know through the work of Gilles Clément, and one of the great books that works in that space is Teresa Galeazza's The Same Landscape. But I think really finding a new space for landscape architecture between gardening and design is, for me, the challenge of the profession. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Julian. Questions? Yes.
It seems like to me this difference between the white collar and blue collar is like a result of having like a very formal system of how we design gardens.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how you incorporate, or how you might incorporate informal gardening practices, or like what we might, just people, like random people have a garden, because they're both like the designers and the gardeners.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about like how?
Yeah, I mean that's how I ended up in this case study here. Obviously, is to try to find somebody who's working entirely, who's not a designer, no training as a designer, no training as a gardener. So obviously he's a scientist, but it's not like he never had a plan. In a sense, it's informal. In a sense, it's not a vernacular garden. And I think that I've done a lot of research and been working on a project called Gardens of Europe, which is about this informal settlement outside Cape Town Airport. And it's called the Gardens of Europe because the informal settlement is called Europe. And that's because most of the people who fly out of Cape Town Airport are from Europe. And the staff mostly work at the airport, and this is their garden. And so a lot of my next research is around land tenure and the relationship of land tenure and landscape architecture. And so in the process of looking at the informal land tenure systems that are happening in that place, I noticed that there were a lot of these gardens, these vernacular gardens there. Obviously, I think vernacular is a terrible sort of term. It sort of puts a particular frame around it. The reason in the book, what I try to do is I call it learning. The role of learning in gardening in the Viridic is something I focus on, because I think that's the key way that we have to operate, is through that process of learning. And I think gardeners always do it. Interestingly, in South Africa, these people are from a Xhosa background, which is a language group that comes from the Eastern Cape, and they don't have a word for garden. The word they've developed is this word Izzy garden, the same they call this Izzy Coke, because it's a pronoun of putting Izzy on front of Coke, because they never had a word in their language for Coke, and they never had a word for garden. Because gardens were something for them that were something that children did to learn about agriculture. And so, interestingly, when I started to talk to this, and I found this amazing garden from this guy called Sakila, and I've written about this and published it in LA Plus, the first edition of LA Plus. Oh no, Identity, the Identity issue of LA Plus. And it's interesting because, in actual fact, I started to talk to him about productive landscape because, you know, we're so fascinated by that these days. And he was very, very sure that this was ornamental. Because, of course, his space of his life was so much based around doing stuff for people and functionality and working, that the idea of having something that was completely ornamental, completely unrelated to his culture, was for him the most exciting thing. It was a sign of prestige for him. I've got this, you know, people would say, why aren't you growing vegetables here? And he's like, I'm not on the red line, I've got a garden. You know, I prove my status to this community by the fact that I'm doing this useless thing and I love it. And he uses a lovely analogy that, you know, in the morning he waters the garden and then he gets a glass of water and he drinks the water while the plants are drinking the water. It was like, you can't make that stuff up. And it was really, you know, it was amazing. So I think that there is a big role in that, and part of this, I think, is about recognising the role of the garden as a teaching space in which people who are non-experts can learn about the garden. So I'm totally into it. Probably not developed in as much depth in the book as it could be, but other places, yes.
I'm curious what you think about some of the people that are breaking away from the way we did plants in the 70s and 80s. You know, I mean, I worked on jobs where we specified 8, 10, 12-inch caliper trees. Now, Davania, Key Nest, you know, at the Tate Modern, you know, it's cheaper and you get the immediate effect by planting a lot of very small things and letting them grow and sort
of. That's for me. That's what I've been. I mean, when I went to horticulture school, you know, the horticulture school was covered in experiments, and my favourite experiment that was being done by a lecturer there, it's in the 80s, was to get a whole lot of eucalyptus trees and plant them at 100mm centres. And then afterwards to get a chainsaw and cut a path through it. Yeah. And it was like a great project. And I've done that, working in the tropics. In Brisbane, I had to do in my own professional practice projects like that, because if you plant a tree in the tropics that's a rainforest tree, because it gets a huge amount of sun, it just turns into a ball, because there's no competition. There's no reason why it would go up. It gets all of its photosynthesis by being a ball. You have to use density. And so I always do my projects up there by specifying a forest, another forest, and then let's subtract from that forest over time. I think it's a logical way to work, you know. But it assumes, in a way, someone's going to come back and understand that process of thinning and simplifying and potentially lifting crowns and doing all of that sort of stuff.
Subtraction.
Yeah, subtraction.
Do you also find time to garden for your own?
It's interesting, my wife's not here, she would have an interesting perspective on this, which is that I'm good at outdoor plants, but at the moment we have more indoor plants, and I'm really bad at indoor plants. And she always has this thing where she says to me, how come you can't do indoor plants but you can do outdoor plants? Why do I have to be the one who does the indoor plants? And it's like, because I know soil, I know that soil also has a buffering capacity insofar as not just the scientific sort of buffering capacity, but draws water from different places. I can put my finger in the soil and understand it, but indoor plants I have more trouble with. So yeah, I think it's an interesting thing to think about, because in a way, if you're really interested in gardening in the long term, you need to get yourself a piece of land as fast as you can, and you need to put stuff in it and just stick with it. And I mean, you know, academics, we're in this, you know, we're like teachers, we're actually moving all the time. And so it's a strange business to have a thing where you're interested in something which is about staying in one place, and you're in a job which is about movement. It's a contradiction. How about you? Are you a gardener?
Yes.
Okay.
I have a very small practice
Yeah.
here locally, and I've had, I'd say, a fairly diverse set of clients in terms of like municipalities or residences or, you know, resorts in the Catskills.
Yeah.
And one
Always
thing,
wanted to go to the Catskills. I just love the name of it. Is it beautiful?
Don't ask
there's
Jamie.
one thing that they all have in common. The first thing they say is, I want no maintenance,
Yeah.
low maintenance. What do you say to that?
I mean, I think it's a. Well, obviously we know that no maintenance doesn't exist. Low maintenance can exist, but at the same time, I'm a lot of the time working the other way, which is that I'm into maintenance, and I'm interested in actually trying to cultivate the client, right? Because a lot of the time, it's because they haven't found a way into the landscape for themselves. They don't have a relationship with the garden. They're hiring you to put it in. In a way, it's something that even when it's going to be in the ground, they don't have an idea. And so what I've done in my own practice is more in Australia than in South Africa, because in South Africa people have a lot of money, but in Australia all the designers like us can't afford to pay anyone to design anything. So a lot of the work that I've done has been around workshops with clients and their friends. And so I've done 5 or 6, I would call them barbecue gardens, where over a series of maybe 3 months, we have a series of workshops in different people's gardens, and we build their gardens and garden their gardens and even propagate all the material ourselves. And in the background, we're drinking beer, we're having a barbecue. It's actually like a recreational activity, but it starts off as a social thing. And in a way, I'm cultivating my clients in that way, and I sell it to them on the basis of, you know, you architects are so cheap you won't spend anything on landscape. The only other thing is to get your mates to do it for free. And so inevitably I think the cultivation of clients is actually part of the job. I mean, there's another side of landscape, which is, you know, you build up that retinue in your head of the plant that's bomb-proof, that will survive anything, you know, that won't get overgrown. But inevitably there's some other person always who's doing that gardening. And that's, you know, the blow and mow thing, right? So that even the person who's talking about a low maintenance landscape still actually has some other silent, mute other who comes through and fixes that up for them. And so I think changing the sort of relationship of the client to landscape is part of the job, or the garden is part of the job that we should be doing.
When can we get your book?
Well, I mean, this comes down to your bookshop, but I will say that one thing that I worked really hard with Roger Canova is it's less than $35, and I think that's not a bad price.
Wow.
And so it's full colour, so we pushed really hard to try to make it a decent price. I think you can even get it for $28 now. But yeah, so
That's dirt cheap.
yeah, and so you can get it from. I think you'll be able to get it from the bookshop on campus here.
Yeah.
If not right now, then soon.
I love your idea of bringing the maintenance plan into what landscape architects do, and really thinking about that, and almost designing the maintenance plan. I guess my question is, do you think if spending time with plants and actually maybe doing some of the physical labor has kind of fallen out of landscape architecture, and we're trying to bring it back in, do you think there's, I guess what I'm wondering is, do you think there are other things that we're focusing on now that we don't need to focus on as much so that we can have more time to do things like maintenance, or thinking about maintenance?
I mean, I think this is an interesting. Obviously, I'm not arguing for the maintenance plan, right? In a way, I'm arguing against the maintenance plan. I'm arguing for a different sort of contract. So I'm arguing for a long-term contract that maybe reduces initial construction cost and instead spreads construction cost over a longer period of time. I mean, the work of Alexander Shemetov at Ile de Nantes, where he went for the competition, and he said, you give me the construction budget over 10 years, don't give it to me right now, and I'll give you a return 10 times over from that construction budget by getting investors to come in getting architects to developing social programs, etc. I'm interested in those change of procurement models which change things like the maintenance plan. In terms of landscape, I think that there's, I know from Brian's interests as well, I know Brian is, better than a lot of people here, so I can't speak about everybody, but, that generation of guys, Brian, Michael Gaffel, I don't know if you've had Michael Gaffel down here, Isaac Hammond, all those guys who are from UVA at that time, all of those guys have an interest in maintenance in relationship to bigger, the dredge guys all have that interest as well. And so I think that in actual fact there is, that is part of the operations, are part of the ether now. But I think that in a way there's still the actual implementation of that into practice is still not really happened in a major sort of way. It's the same as landscape urbanism. I was kind of expecting that by now there'd be a radical transformation of practice on the basis of that generation, and it's not really happened in a sense. And so my project is really specifically, in a way I use the garden, it's a theorising exercise to develop this language for plant design. It leaves open more questions than it closes down. And so yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, thanks very much for a fantastic session. We're going to feed him because he just drove up from Penn State, so and he'll be around this afternoon. He's going to be in Maria's studio in the afternoon. Maybe if you want to grab him and ask some more questions, you can do that.
Thanks for coming along. Thanks, such a nice audience.